It's my complete pleasure this morning to be welcoming Dave Flaks for a conversation about economic development in the city of Vancouver and in Metro Vancouver.
Thank you, Colleen. I'm looking forward to the conversation. And
you introduced me to a book by Dan Bresnitz from the Monk School of Innovation at the University of Toronto, Innovation in Real Places. And in that book, he talks about how economies change in different places over time. He uses the illustration of Israel. He uses the American Rust Belt as examples where the former economies collapsed and they used different strategies and tactics to bring their new economies forward into the future. He also talks about the Canadian example and instruments like the National Research Council IRAP program, for example, as ways of stimulating innovation in our economy. If we look at Vancouver and the region, as I said, we were very dependent on our resource extraction industries, and now we've seen a shift happening in large part to real estate-based industries. What is your take on what, riffing off of Danny's book, what this city and region should be looking at in terms of innovation? One more thing is he talks about not becoming a silicon hyphenate, for example, where we're just a back lot for American multinationals. Can you comment on the line of thinking behind Bresnitz's book?
yeah, it's a brilliant book, and I too am a great fan of Innovation in Real Places and the theses in Dan Bresnitz's book. Let's start with the premise that as a strategic economic prosperity priority for the region, we must catalyze our innovation and entrepreneurial capacity so that we're not only strengthening the comparative or strategic advantages of our existing and fast emerging industries here in the Metro Vancouver region, but perhaps creating entirely new industries that we don't even know about today, whether through recombinant innovation and technologies or through, as Dan points out in his book, second generation component innovation. That requires us to connect our different applied research institutes and universities such as UBC, SFU, to the firms that are part of the industries in which we have productive and or other strategic advantages here in the region. And I'm not sure we've done a great job doing that. The knowledge hubs of the future are the ones that have done the best job of that. A great example, and I think it was highlighted in Dan's book, is the city of Pittsburgh, right? It moved from a steel-based economy, right? It was the headquarters of a lot of steel companies. U.S. Steel was headquartered there. And when that began to contract in the 1970s and even more so in the early 80s, the leaders in Pittsburgh decided, okay, what do we have in the way of assets that we can lever to start to build the next iteration of our economy? And they said, you know what? We have University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon here. Let's use those two incredible institutions as the locus of the next phase of Pittsburgh's economy. And the proof has been in the proverbial pudding in terms of what they've built there. It is one of the most innovative economies on the planet now. It is, in fact, a knowledge hub, right? Because they did that. We too need to look at doing something like that. And not just with UBC, but with our other applied and translational research institutes and hubs. We can't build an economic development strategy and vision that is predicated, as Dan speaks to, on attracting the tertiary offices of multinational corporations here. Because what do we know that happens when they do that? When we attract just an office of an Apple or an Amazon or a Microsoft here? Well, they come into this market, they compete in the same labor markets, the same labor pools as our startup companies, our development stage companies that are already here, are anchored here, want to grow here, want to hire here, want to scale here, want to reinvest here. And the multinationals, of course, will win that labor battle. So they'll get the best the best echelon of labor, right? Leaving our smaller companies that are homegrown companies with, I don't want to say an inferior labor product, but it won't be as good as what the multinationals can afford to get. And yet the productive value of that labor and those tertiary offices all leave this region, right, in the form of royalties, right? They don't stay here to spill over onto the rest of our economy. And that can become a lifeblood issue for this economy, right? Because this is, in fact, an IP-centric, a knowledge-focused, a royalty-based economy, right? It's not land-centric, it's not even labor-centric, it's IP-centric, and it's royalty-based. So when those royalties leave our region, that can become a near existential issue for this economy.
Same thing with the movie business.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
I've been saying that for a long time.
Right. It's not an IP-driven business. We are, in fact, a backlot of Hollywood, right?
Yep.
All the royalties from that, the most lucrative part, by the way, they go back to Hollywood or New York. They do not stay here.
So as long as the salaries are competitive here, the American multinationals will come north to set up, back offices or back lots. And it's going to attract local employment, but then that employment is not available to our local entrepreneurs, our local innovators, and the ones that have the potential of driving the future economy.
Right.
So
Exactly.
Translated, if you want to build the economy, if you think becoming a back office for an American multinational, I've got a bridge I'd like to sell you.
Well, the whole idea is that economic development in a postmodern economy should be predicated on building your economy from within. It's not a series of transactions. It's about building systems and structures to support your firms and thus your key industries, i.e. those in which you have productive and other strategic advantages vis-a-vis the rest of the world, right? That's capacity building within an economy, right? So that we are focused on those industries that are once export-oriented, right? Because we want them selling all over the world, right? So they're bringing that capital, wealth, and investment back into our region to have ripple effects onto the rest of our economy. We want to focus on industries that are competitive, growing, and that pay an average annual wage is above the average wage paid across all industries. We at Invest Vancouver have, again, identified 7 industry clusters that meet each criterion: apparel tech, agri-tech, life sciences, green economy, digital media entertainment, infotech and software, transportation and logistics. So that we need to take an idea to export perspective, examining the entire product service value chain continuums associated with and driving those key traded innovation intensive industries, from research to design, to create, to build, to market, all the way through to export, so that we as economic developers and you as a public policy or economic policy decision maker understand what do we have as a region in terms of the key economic, networking, physical, talent, education, capital, R&D, and other economic development related assets that we have at our disposal here, but that perhaps we need to better align and deploy in a way that is more conducive for strengthening and growing these key traded innovation intensive industries in which we have productive and or other strategic advantages versus the rest of the world. It's capacity building 101.
Right.
And too long, Colin, we have not focused on that as a region. Instead, we've looked at economic development as a series of transactions. Did we attract this office in this region or this investment? That is not going to move the needle.
Interesting. Well, we used to be accused of being an economy that was based on hewers of wood and drawers of water, and that we were shipping raw logs to Japan or wherever at the time. what we're talking about is an intellectual industries equivalent to hewers of wood and drawers of water, if all we're doing is acting as a backlot.
Right.
And that's not going to help us build our economy. How do we choose which?
And that's a great point, Colleen, because in that economy, there was very little, quote unquote, value added to it, right? It was just the logs going on ships and going to other places in the world. Same thing could be said in some respects about an economy that is built on the backs of tertiary offices of multinational corporations.
So how do we identify which industries to riff off? Basically, if going back to Bresnitz's book, they identified characteristics that were unique to the place.
Yes.
And then riffed off those. And the normal process being, if you've got an innovation, it starts, and it's able to scale, it starts to spin off corollary industries around it. Can you comment on your research and understanding, since you've been here, on where you see the breakouts taking place?
Yeah, certainly. And again, we've identified some of those industry clusters, and we've dug deeper into the disciplines or subspecializations within those industry clusters, right? The sectoral productive advantages that we have here. And we're seeing some really compelling things in agritech, in hydrogen. We have a fast-growing hydrogen industry here. We've been building it for about 4 decades, and now the global market has finally caught up. Obviously, biopharmaceuticals is fast-growing. We have a lot of anchor companies here, again, homegrown ones, like, of course, Cllr is the most well-known, but a lot behind that, too, that are incredibly exciting. And I think your great point about understanding where our research competencies lie, right? Because in an IP-centric, a knowledge-based, a royalty-focused economy, that's what's going to be the primary driver of what's coming down the pike in terms of those industrial specializations. So that's where you need to start. Where do our applied and translational research strengths lie? And how do we move more of that applied research into proof of concept and then into commercial viability, right? So how do we get that applied research through get the IP out of the academic setting through tech transfer into the hands of firms that can actually commercialize that research, right? And that was part of Dan Bresnitz's book too. He said, too often here, we conflate invention with innovation, right? And innovation is the commercialization of that invention, right? And invention is probably the better role for government, right, to play a role, because there aren't a lot of capitalists that are going to underwrite invention. But commercialization of that invention, i.e. innovation, well, that happens with entrepreneurs and startup firms. And so that we should leave it to them to commercialize that invention, right? That's their part of this equation. And so I think as we're looking towards what is going to be driving this economy in the future, we need to start at our research centers and look at the applied research that's being done there, because that will be indicative of the industries that are going to really be growing here.
One of my observations as a serial entrepreneur myself is that there has been good government support at the innovation, at the first early stage, IRAP, for example, getting the invention stage going. But when it comes to commercializing and scaling the products, the supports are not there.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I'm actually hearing that capital access, formation, syndication is not a problem here, that there is plenty of capital available at all stages. And there are folks up here from the Valley and from Southern California and from all over the US and from the East Coast of Canada that do come here and invest in myriad companies here. I actually have heard that the problem is more that there aren't enough investment-worthy companies here. And I've heard that from local VCs too. And in fact, a number of local VCs have deployed capital south of the border because they can't find enough good companies in which to invest. But there are some real pain points that we're seeing in terms of company scaling and moving from de facto science projects to startups to development stage companies and beyond. And certainly procurement is a constriction or pain point. And listen, government procurement especially, that it's not built to take risks. And somehow we need to figure out ways where governmental bodies or entities can participate more in the development of our firms, and that there's more of a willingness for in procurement to try out new technologies, products, processes, and services. Somehow we need to figure out a way to de-risk that. And we have some ideas that have been promulgated in some of our reports in clean transportation and agritech. But that is an important one. What we are seeing as a real constraint, though, is the availability of space.
Right.
That is a real hindrance. And we're hearing that time and again from companies. They just can't find the requisite spaces, whether it's wet lab spaces in biopharmaceuticals, whether it's prototyping spaces in clean transportation and agritech, whether it's maker spaces, whether it's small volume manufacturing spaces. There just isn't enough space. The other major constriction point is talent, skilled talent. We're hearing from many companies, and I've heard it personally from a panoply of companies based here, that skilled talent, especially executive level talent, is very hard to come by here. I spoke with a really exciting biopharmaceuticals company here based in the city of Vancouver that is having to contract out for that talent, contract with individuals based in the Research Triangle or Boston, Cambridge, or San Diego in the Torrey Pines area. And those folks aren't willing to come up here because they don't believe that there's enough of a concentration of firms here so that if it goes poorly with this one biopharmaceuticals company, that they could go down the street and find a new job somewhere else.
Right.
So they're not willing to take the risk to come up here. And that's a problem. So much so that this firm is quite worried that as it goes out for its next round of financing, that within the term sheet that they're going to ask this firm to leave the region because it can't find the requisite factors of production or inputs to be successful here. So that is a real problem, and that problem may even connect to our physical space problem.
Right.
Because we don't have a Torrey Pines here. We don't have a Mission Bay in South San Francisco. We don't have a Kendall Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts, meaning we don't have that physical agglomeration that begets industrial agglomeration, right? Where those creative collisions happen, where firms are spun out of anchor companies and they're all domiciled within spatial proximity of one another. We need that here. And it may happen with St. Paul with what's going on at St. Paul's Hospital, but who knows? But we need those physical spaces because they do lead to industrial agglomeration.
Well, physical space, I mean, Vancouver, strictly speaking, is from Boundary Road to the University Endowment Lands. It's 115 square kilometers, and we have very limited industrial space.
Yes.
30 years ago when I was working in the film industry, I was always, more than that now, when I started as a location manager, I was out looking for space to shoot all the time. I was looking for warehouses, anything that wasn't being, used maximally so that we could use it for places to film. Most of that's been eaten up now.
Yes.
I used to be, I had the old Carling O'Keefe Brewery, I had the old GMC Parts building, all of these buildings that have been subsequently redeveloped either into residential development or retail development. So the long and the short of it, there's just fewer places to work. And I can't see that reversing with all of the pressure on residential development.
Agreed. And we have to rethink how we're going to provide those job supporting spaces, because you're right, there just isn't enough space, and a lot of firms need quite a bit of space to be successful, especially as they move from development stage to commercial stage to production stage, right? So something that we've recommended is looking at this challenge mega regionally, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe that production space can't be here within the Metro Vancouver region, and there's still some industrial spaces in Surrey and some other areas that are coming online and will be available. But eventually we may run out of that too. So maybe we look north in the province. Maybe we look east. Maybe we look south of the border in the northeastern part of the state of Washington. A great example of where they've done something interesting is San Diego. San Diego has taken a mega-regional approach to its economy, so that its economy, it doesn't just look at it as being circumscribed by the political boundaries of the county of San Diego, but it includes Imperial County, which is very rural, and most importantly, it includes the state of Baja and Mexico. And so a lot of that production capacity in San Diego, right, it's got obviously probably the world's most concentrated biopharmaceuticals industry. It's got one of the most specialized, highly specialized aerospace industries. It's got an incredible ICT industry and a ZEV industry. A lot of that production has moved down into the state of Baja, in Tijuana and Mexicali. So much so that the state of Baja now has one of the most advanced additive manufacturing industries on the planet, right? And they've quantified the economic impacts of this mega-regional approach in the sense that every job created and I think the World Trade Center San Diego did this report a few years ago. Every job created down in the state of Baja, Mexico, I think supports another 5 or so jobs north of the border, right? That's powerful. So we need to think like that too, mega regionally, right? Mm-hmm. Because we want to keep that production-based capacity here. We do not want to cede it. Right? Because what do we know when we do seed it, right? As Andy Grove, one of the co-founders of Intel, said, once you seed that production-based capacity, it's not too long before your R&D and then your headquarters leave with it. We know of a lot of firms that have put their production in places like Arizona or the southeastern United States. That does not bode well for us. We need to protect that, right? So maybe if we think mega-regionally, that maybe the production doesn't stay in this region, but because it's within close proximity, we're still able to keep the R&D and most importantly, the HQs, right? The headquarters of these firms, right? Yeah. That's a win.
So let's talk about those headquarters and office space generally. We've seen over the course of the pandemic that more, especially knowledge-based industries, the employees are working remotely. Mm-hmm. And so the whole, historical practice of going downtown because that's where the office was has really profoundly shifted. And yet we still see, I do, at the City of Vancouver, ongoing pressure to build more office space. Can you comment on how you see the office space relationship changing over time?
I mean, right now, at this point in time, it looks like that a hybrid approach is here to stay. I'm not a real estate developer, so I'd be reticent to comment on, again, forecasting what this will look like 5 years from now. I know in certain industries there is a pressure to bring workers back into the office, especially those industries that are really dependent on that social capital development, i.e. those relationships like finance, for example. But many others, I think a hybrid approach works, which means less square footage, right? You're going to have people sharing desks, sharing offices, et cetera. So again, it's something that we need to assess and really think about in a circumspect way. We need to be really prudent about this, because the worst thing we could do is overbuild commercial spaces, right? Because that crowds out, what we ought to be building instead, where we ought to be deploying that capital instead, right? Which has downstream distortive and thus deleterious impacts on what we're trying to do here from an economic development perspective.
Well, case in point right now, timely, is the Broadway Plan, which is before council, where they're projecting 40 to 50,000 new jobs along the Broadway corridor within Vancouver without any rationalization behind what would be driving those jobs or those workspaces. So that's one of the things that I've been questioning is this makes no sense. It's running counter to everything that we're seeing happening, especially in the knowledge-based industries. They're looking, I think, at things like medical industries, biotech spin-offs, but putting that in high-rise office space just seems contrary to the direction that those industries are taking.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how that works out. I think the point to keep in mind too, as this economy becomes more dependent on those quote unquote knowledge-based industries, right? Infotech, software, Web3, of course, biopharmaceuticals, next generation mobility and stuff. I'm not sure the traditional office environment works for those industrial categories as much as it does for ones that supported our economy maybe 20 or 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. These tend to be many of them are production-based, number one, which by definition means that there's some manufacturing involved, right, which is just a process of transformation. It's not its own industry. We have many production-based industries. And I think one hallmark of these industries is that they're not labor-intensive, but they're knowledge intensive, right? They are not our grandparents' industries where you have lots of people in high concentration of workers in spaces. It just doesn't work like that. So these are all things that we have to consider as we are developing the real estate to support these industries. Again, this is an economy that is moving away from being a labor-intensive one to one where the primary factors of production or anchors of value creation and capture are IP, capital, knowledge, data, and other intangible assets. So that means a different workspace environment. So, we need to really do a deep assessment of what that looks like.
Well, indeed, right. And I'm concerned that we're using an out-of-date paradigm in terms of land use and planning, given everything we know in the direction we're taking.
Perhaps. Status quo is a powerful anchor, right? And we default to what we know. But this, to accommodate this future economy that we all want, takes a certain level of enlightened thinking about it, right? In terms of all the inputs or factors of production, not just physical spaces and land, but we have to rethink how capital is deployed. We need to rethink, of course, our labor systems, structures, institutions, and markets. We have to rethink public policy. We have to rethink administrative law. All these things need to be rethought.
Similarly, in the land use vein, we talk about complete communities. And when I talk about the livable city, it's a combination of things. It's housing, it's transportation, it's community amenities, but it's also commercial activity. And we are looking towards a future where people can live and work in proximity, not be reliant on commuting to get to the job. Can you see ways that we can be integrating commercial activity in the form of job space into residential neighborhoods?
Yes, certainly. I think where I currently live is an exemplar of that, and that's Mount Pleasant. There's all my community amenities are within walking distance, right? Grocery stores, great restaurants, entertainment venues, and there are lots of firms that are siting there and that are building new spaces there, including Semios and Cllrs in the neighborhood and many others. And I think that is a great integration of spaces, right? There's light industrial, there's commercial, there are spaces for incubation and probably some prototyping. There are retail spaces. I think it is an area that is starting to get that right. And these models exist all over the world, right? Everyone looks to what's the one outside of DC, Clarendon, Virginia, where they have metro access, they have entertainment, they have a lot of commercial, some industrial near there, lots of residential, and it's all integrated and it's all walkable. And it basically creates a better quality of life for the residents, for the workers, and for everyone. And I think that is going to be the model of the future. It already is, let's face it.
How important do you think it is to preserve our existing industrial land base?
Incredibly. Those spaces should be sacrosanct, frankly. And we need to create more of it, in fact. But we should not give away what's left of our industrial base. I believe the vacancy rate is less than 1%. It might even be half a point. I mean, that's just astounding. That is not sustainable. Firms have nowhere to go, and they will leave quickly. So we need to protect it. And we need to somehow figure out ways to create more of it, whether it's stackable industrial or taking a mega-regional approach. But we have to figure out a way to accommodate the physical space needs and requirements of firms within our growth industries, many of which are production-based industries. We cannot continue to give away our industrial spaces for population accommodating uses. It will destroy this economy.
Well, in fact, what I have been seeing over the course of this term, and I'll use the example along 2nd to 6th on the south side of False Creek and the Fairview slopes through Mount Pleasant, that many industrial or light industrial buildings are being rezoned to allow residential density over supposed industrial space. Maybe could be considered stackable using your parlance, but by and large, what I see it more happening is this is an excuse to build more residential density at the cost and sacrifice of light industrial land.
It's a super point, Colleen. And what do we know that happens when you build residential that abuts industrial? It transitions, right? The economics change, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you're living in that residential tower, do you want trucks rumbling in your neighborhood at 2 a.m.? No, they're going to call you as a council member and say, hey, Colleen, do something about this, right? And you're going to do something about it, right? Because those are your constituents. So what we know happens time and again is that industrial will transition and go away. So we have to create strict demarcations, right? If at all possible. I mean, light may be okay to be spatially near residential, but it's worrisome because we've seen this play out in urban cores all over the world.
Can you talk a little bit about the financialization of real estate and its impact on the economy?
Yeah, I mean, and this isn't uniquely endemic to the Vancouver region, but we've seen a lot of regions where real estate is treated like another financial instrument or asset, much like a stock or bond, right? So it's held, it's traded, it's just another asset, right? Not as we would see it as a place to live, a place to
Home.
exactly, to put your family, to grow your family, and to live over many years. But because real estate, especially residential real estate, has accreted so much in value that it's treated like another security. And that puts a lot of pressure on the market, right? Because it's either taken out of commission, or you get large firms that buy up a lot of residential real estate and hold that.
REITs, you
right,
mean?
exactly. And you've seen that particularly in a lot of cities in the U.S. And even though it's still relatively a small percentage, right? The Blackstones and the BlackRocks that have bought up a lot of residential real estate after the global financial crisis. But because after the global financial crisis, that a lot of builders became very risk averse, and we didn't build enough. This is just the U.S. I'm talking about, to support population growth, that when you take large swaths of residential real estate out of commission and you hold it like a financial security or asset, that puts a lot of pressure on the market. And that's what we've seen in certain places. So.
Well, we've also seen, large-scale housing production here done with the intent of offshore sales, where developers set up showrooms from Shanghai to Dubai. And because of that upward pressure, it's really creating a greater divide between global wealth and the local economy, pricing the locals out of the market.
Yeah.
Is that something that you've seen happening in other global cities?
Sure. Again, a lot of wealth is parked in real estate, right? And that's the financialization of real estate. That folks treat it like just another asset, and they hold those properties like they would a stock, right? And hold them long term, and then maybe trade out of them. So it's something we're seeing in a lot of places, right?
And things like, we've brought the empty homes tax in here, but that's just a cost of doing. That's just a cost of the investment, as it were.
Yeah. In fact, a real estate agent, when I first came up here, I was looking for a place, and the real estate agent told me about the foreign buyer's tax, which I believe is 20% of the purchase price. And I said, wow, that's quite pricey. And he said, it doesn't matter to most people. It is just, in fact, the cost. And most people, they look at it as just the price they pay to put their money here. And you've seen it in other cities. Look at Billionaires Row in New York City, right along Central Park. Right, a lot of those apartments there are empty, but folks they want to deploy their money in safe assets in safe political jurisdictions, right?
And people always point to our magnificent scenery, our mountains and ocean, as being a driver for population growth in the economy. Maybe that is a segue into talking about tourism as an industry. A lot of people say, oh, well, we've got a great tourism industry. We knew it was vulnerable around things like cruise ships during the pandemic. But do you have anything broadly you can say about the tourism industry? One of my concerns is, of course, that it really supports low-wage jobs.
That's my concern as well. The jobs tend to be low-wage service sector jobs. They're not primarily family supporting. And so we don't want to, obviously tourism's important. We want to see a healthy and strong tourism industry, especially in business tourism. But we don't want to hang our hats on that, right? That's not going to be a major driver of our economy going forward. We should look to other places. It is an export-oriented industry, but again, the types of jobs, and the wage scales that are supported by our tourism industry are not great. It's why we, as an economic development leadership service, do not focus on our tourism industry.
So what we need to be striving for is a balance. Again,
course.
those low-wage jobs are not going to be able to afford to live within the city of Vancouver,
true.
given the current paradigm.
Very true. And we want to upskill, retool more of those workers for new occupational categories that are family supporting, right? Because what do we know about tourism too? That it is going to be one of the industries most affected by automation and other modalities of capital labor substitution, right? So when you have large swaths of workers that are going to become dislocated, disemployed, right? Meaning the job goes away completely, or maybe even non-employed when their job goes away, meaning they're completely detached from the labor force or labor markets. Well, you need to reabsorb and retrain those folks, right? So that's going to put pressure on our talent development structure, systems, and institutions to figure out how to upskill and place more of those folks. And that's something we too need to think about deeply here as a region.
One of, riffing off of that, we've seen an industry develop around international students. I don't know if that's something that you've looked at, but the post-secondary institutions, the large, medium, and small ones across the city, are servicing hundreds of thousands of students from all over the world, from China, from India. What role do you see this international student market having on our economy?
It's incredibly important, especially if they stay here, to form and grow firms, right? I mean, Silicon Valley was in large part built off the backs of highly skilled, educated immigrants. And I think we should look at that as a model for what we can do here. We want them to stay here and build companies here and invest here. I think that can be a powerful catalyst for our economy going forward.
It also has real estate implications,
It does.
as you can imagine.
Sure, of course. But I think the upside far outweighs the more maleficent impacts.
I have two more questions,
Sure.
just in considering time. The first, I'd like to talk about the film and television industry
Sure.
for a minute. You know, as you and I have discussed before, we are a production center. We are a backlot for Hollywood North. It's kind of in similar fashion to what we were talking about with silicon hyphenates in the technology industry. Vancouver is a place to go to shoot. You know, we're in the same time zone. We have an 80-cent dollar. We provide tax incentives to come and film here. But production is only one small part of the industry, which goes from finance and development through production, marketing, and distribution. Can you comment on the importance of being able to participate in the overall industry, especially from the ownership of the intellectual property and the implications of that?
That's the most important part. It's the most lucrative part of the industry. We know that out of Los Angeles, for example, the most valuable export are film and television royalties, right? We want a part of that, right? Because otherwise, it's just the downstream impacts of that we're getting here, right? It's the film and television industry, production industry supports a lot of jobs and supports a lot of value add, right? In terms of the indirect and induced economic contributions, right? Fiscal and job and output, et cetera. But when the most lucrative part goes back to Los Angeles and keeps paying coupons on that, right? When everyone watches a movie or a television show, we're losing out completely on that. So we have to figure out a way to support more of that IP-driven part of the industry, right? The facets of the industry. And I think we're seeing more of that with more interactive digital media here, and a lot of firms that have maybe been fomented out of our more traditional film and television production industry, because there is a lot of talent here and that are growing, but we really have to support that part of the industry. But because that's where the real proverbial economic bang for the buck is, right? It's not in just being a production center, because frankly, when you think about it, are we any different than maybe what Shenzhen is to iPhones, right? Supports, hundreds of thousands of jobs building the iPhone in Shenzhen, but all the royalties go back to Cupertino.
Right.
Do we just want to be that in film and television? And then it also becomes a race to the bottom, because you're, of course, dependent on a very lucrative film and television tax credit. We know that there are many others popping up, right? And so do you make it more lucrative as, Montreal makes their interactive digital media tax credit more lucrative, as Louisiana grows theirs, as, Georgia grows theirs, as the UK grows theirs? And you see these production facilities popping up all over the world, right? And frankly, I think that market is saturated, right? You're seeing these huge film production facilities in Ireland and outside of London, outside of New Orleans, in LA, of course, in New York, and now even in some tertiary locations, right?
Yep.
So it's becoming diffuse, right? A lot of this production is going on all over the place, right? And eventually, we're going to see content development pull back. We already are, right? We saw Netflix's earnings and everything else. They have been profligate spenders over the last, 5-8 years, and especially during the pandemic. And now they're starting to pull back because their earnings haven't supported that. So they're going to pull back their costs. So a lot of that production spend will probably go away. So if you don't own the IP and you're only building your industry on the production, poof, right?
I've been trying to get this point across for the last 20 years, and unsuccessfully, unfortunately, which is why I got out of the film and television industry, because I would argue that we're the creative industry's equivalent to hewers of wood and drawers of water. And we really do need to own the intellectual property, or at least participate in it.
Yeah.
But that's not something the city can do anything about. The city, again, is 115 square kilometers, and it has limitations on what it can do, and it's tied to the land. So from an economic standpoint, as we look at our industrial future, the future economy, it really does come down to land use from my perspective. So when I look at an industry like film and television, it comes down to where do we shoot? Where do we park the trucks? Where do we get our power? Can we have police and controls on it, as opposed to jumping on a plane and going to Los Angeles or going to Cannes and anything like that. And that's just illustrative of the reality of many different industries that are operating within Vancouver proper. So from an economic standpoint, we have the Vancouver Economic Commission, you're at Invest Vancouver. What do you see that at the municipal level the city can be doing to foster industry staying in Vancouver, in creative industries and across the board?
I think, again, we have to rethink what economic development means in the globotics economy. And we have to move away from the more, what I would call, I guess, archaic or antediluvian precepts of economic development that's focused almost exclusively on business attraction. These quick wins, as they call them, right? The transactional aspects of it. Mm-hmm. It's a nice tactic, but it is not being strategic about economic development, i.e. playing to your industrial strengths, specializations, firm and employment concentrations, productive and other strategic advantages, right? I think that it's important that we also remember that when you hang your hat on business or investment attraction as your primary economic development mechanism, you are buying into two premises that I think are wholly faulty, if not completely chimerical. And I mean that its actual definition being an unreal creature of imagination, in the sense that the two premises are as follows. First, you're assuming or presuming that there's a long line of new market entrants trying to get in this market. I assure you that is not the case, right? The second premise is that business attraction is actually going to move the needle in this economy. And as we've discussed at length during this conversation, I assure you that too is absolutely not true, right? Because again, we're not attracting headquarters here. It is highly delusive to think that Amazon was going to move its second headquarters 120 miles up the I-5 and plop it in Vancouver. It never made sense. It was a highly fatuous exercise, right? And what we are attracting, not headquarters, but again, offices of major multinational corporations. That will not move the needle the way we want it to. It will not have the downstream economic impacts or contributions that we expect or aspire for. So I think that's what's required. It's almost an ethos change about economic development. And I think that is probably one of the most important things that we have done as an economic development leadership service, to really show, to demonstrably show that there's a better way to do economic development.
Fantastic. So thanks so much, Dave, for making the time to come and talk to me today about this. I know there'll be a lot of people that are interested to hear this conversation. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, Colleen. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.